Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another one of our KASB advocacy updates. It is week 2 of the legislative session, and already our advocacy team has been busy keeping track of legislation in both the Senate and House chambers and a number of committees. So I am just tickled to be joined today by our advocacy staff. We've got Scott Rothschild, Leah Fleiter, and Mark Tallman here to keep us all up to date on what's happening at both the state and federal levels. So to the three of you, thank you for your hard work in week 2, and we're excited to hear what we've got to learn from all of you this week. Leah, let's start with you and some news on the federal side. President-elect Biden unveiled a big proposal last night that included some money for schools in response to COVID-19. So what did we learn from the president-elect, and what might we expect from that proposed legislation?
That's right, Austin. It's a $1.9 trillion package overall, but I'm just going to kind of focus on what's most relevant to K-12 education. It's about $130 billion for K-12. That's in comparison to the $54 billion that was just passed in what I'm just going to call the CARES Act 2 that was just signed right before the end of 2020. And that CARES Act 2 funding funnels about $350 million to Kansas. And so that's just to give you some context there. $130 billion for K-12 in this new proposal. The plan envisions using that money to hire more teachers, to reduce class size, to modify some of your spaces so that you can increase social distancing, improve ventilation, hire more maintenance staff, purchase PPE, hire more nurses so that there's a nurse for every school. I think that would be popular for a lot of our folks. Hire more counselors to address mental health and as well as learning loss issues, address the digital divide. I haven't seen figures on that yet, but you all know that the digital divide or the homework gap, of course, is something that we continue to focus on. And it talks about using the funding for summer school or other supports to address learning loss. We know that you all are struggling with that, or maybe the students are, because of the impacts of the COVID pandemic. And that has been something that we know is a conversation in your communities and with your boards, and how that can be addressed. And this $130 billion does have some direction or guidance to use that money for learning loss. It also would allow school districts to access FEMA money for certain COVID expenses. I know that was something that some of you had hoped to do in the last couple of rounds of federal relief, and that didn't really happen. And so that's another focus there. All of that, of course, based around COVID response. And the bill also includes, in contrast to the CARES 2 that just passed at the end of the calendar year, this bill also includes $350 billion for state, local, and tribal governments. And so that's been something we've all been hoping for, because, if we can help prop up state budgets, then that hopefully rescues the governor from having to make further budget cuts that could touch K-12 education. And we're going to talk about the state budget here in just a few minutes with Mark. So again, $130 billion, that's the figure for K-12, $170 billion, I think, for, education overall. Of course, the challenge with all this is that the president-elect has proposed this, but it has quite a ways to go before it passes Congress. We know we have a House that is mostly Democratic. It's controlled by the Democratic Party. We've got, at this time, pretty much a 50-50 split in the Senate, with the vice president required to break any ties. So this is great news for a lot of us as far as the dollar levels, but we still have quite a bit of work to do before any of these impacts might become law. So Scott and Mark, you want to add any observations on this federal bill or federal proposal that we just learned about last night?
The only thing I'd say is that because this is just a proposal, a better chance of things passing because of the change in the control of the Senate. But there is the opportunity, I think, for education leaders to have maybe a little more input into things like how the funding, how funding might be divided among schools, some of those issues that really weren't up for much discussion the last time. The other thing, though, and I think we're going to talk about this nearer the end, but just go back to get people thinking, this is a lot of money. We have to know how to spend it well to get those results. So, it's like, don't plan for money you don't have yet, because we don't, but understand that this is the kind of thing that could turn out. We do get it. What plan are we going to have? What are we able to share with the legislature and others to talk about? Here's why we need the money and where it's going to go.
Great point, Mark. And it'll certainly be interesting to watch how the Senate in particular plays out here over the first few months of the Biden administration. Leah, we do have a question in the chat related to the proposed bill, wondering if the funding for that will be based on Title I as the previous CARE Act's funding had
I
been.
haven't seen any details on that. That's a great question. And yeah, I think there's some feeling that, boy, it would be helpful if that could perhaps be allocated differently or in a more flexible way. I don't have a lot of details yet on that. I keep watching for updates from our national group, and I haven't seen anything on that yet, but I know that's an item of concern. I also wanted to mention that the bill the proposal would extend that Families First Coronavirus Relief Act leave that expired at the end of the calendar year. It would extend that in order to help families recover from COVID by not having to go to work when they are ill. So, lots of moving pieces, and we really don't know too many details as of 12:07 today, Kansas time.
Yeah, it'll be a work in progress for sure, and we always appreciate you keeping track of that, and know you'll bring us information as it becomes available at that federal level, particularly on that bill. Well, let's turn fairly quickly to the state of Kansas and some of the news that was made this week. Big news was tied to the governor's office, and in particular, her introduction of her budget proposal that she'll send to the legislature. Mark, you want to give us an overview of what the governor had to share and what that means for public education?
Absolutely. There are some details available that we've posted on our website. If you go to our KSB news section, there's a story where this is all written down. We've also provided links to the full budget documents if you want them. But let's talk about first what it does for K-12. It fully funds the Gannon School Finance Law settlement, including the money for the ongoing increases in base state aid that were approved. However, it also, as that law works, means that because weighted enrollment is down this year and is expected to be down a little bit next year, it's actually providing less dollars than was expected last year because our estimated enrollment is down. Remember, I think most of you are aware, you can use the previous year or the second previous year enrollment for most of your budget, but weightings go on a year-to-year basis. So we're funding the law, but because weightings are down, this reduces the cost to the state this year by something like $20 million. It provides an increase of $7.5 million for special education over the next 2 years, but that's not growing as fast as special education costs are growing. So that excess cost amount is expected to continue to drop down a little bit. Instead of moving up toward the 92% target, we're probably going to drop below 70%, which is about where we are now. It funds all of the equalization formulas for capital outlay, bond and interest, local option budget. However, the governor again takes away some money for some small programs. We've all read the top numbers. Now we're trying to get into the details. One fairly large program in recent years that is outside the formula is the mental health intervention program. That continues to be funded, and the recommended level for next year is the same as the level in the current year. But the governor does not recommend any funding for some programs that have been around in the past. The school safety grants, professional development dollars, tech ed transportation, reading grants, the juvenile crisis pilot project, teacher excellence grants, Teach for America. Most of these are only, maybe a couple $100,000, I say only. And the governor in the past has tended to put her focus on more money in the base. So if you've got kind of a favorite little project, you may want to check on that. Probably also noteworthy that some of these things, again, not to count the federal money before the check arrives, are things like, reading grants. Some of those things might be able to be supplemented by federal funding if that's possible. There's a couple things that is more detail than you want to know, but I'm quickly going to mention in case you hear it from legislators or others. To manage the state's cash flow problem for the current year, the governor in her allotments is delaying $79 million in general state aid in the current year that will not be paid till next year. Your budgets, though, are to show that you're getting the money. This happens every year, but it's a bigger amount. So your general fund legal max budgets show about $100 million increase, a little less than that, because of the base state aid increase. But when the state looks at it from the state's viewpoint, funding isn't going up at all this year. Then next year, base state aid goes up $200 million, but you're only getting another $100 million for the next step. Likewise, the governor had a one-year moratorium on contributions to CAPERS, death, and disability, which artificially lowers what the state is spending on CAPERS this year. That pops back up next year. So part of the reason that the governor was able to sort of manage through these problems is we did a lot of kind of one-time cuts and shifting this year, but they come back next year. And so the budget kind of looks weird, and it looks maybe less maybe stable than it normally would be. The governor is proposing, as she is required to by law, a 7.5% ending balance for the year ending next year, because the year we're in right now, fiscal year ends June 30th. For the following year, which is the budget the legislature is really working on, would have a $600 million ending balance. That's 7.5%. That sounds good, but the governor's doing a couple things that legislators have already signaled some opposition to. Number one, she's proposing for the third year in a row to re-amortize CAPERS. That would save in next year's budget $158 million. That's part of how she gets the $600 million. And if you are not familiar, to quickly remind you what re-amortizing is, the amount of money the legislature puts into CAPERS every year, which goes through your budget for your employees, is calculated by the amount of money necessary to eliminate the unfunded liability of the system within 15 years. And that's a hard date. The governor is proposing to add 10 more years onto that target. So just as if you refinanced your house or a loan or took out a new credit card, debt consolidation plan, the governor's basically saying, let's spend less every year now, but it means we're going to be spending over a longer period of time. And there's been a lot of legislative opposition to this, and we expect that will continue. Second, the governor is proposing she would phrase it as closing loopholes in some areas, which really come down to things like adding the sales tax to like ebooks or video products, Netflix, streaming. Right now, if you buy a book, you pay sales tax. If you go to the movies, if anyone's going to the movies, you pay sales tax. But if you are streaming while you're stuck at home, you don't pay sales tax on that. So the governor says that's a way to equalize the tax burden. Also, to do something that has to do with marketplace, whatever, that I don't pretend to understand, but it's all a matter of e-commerce. And these two together would raise about $80 million. Governor last year proposed doing this, but had some targeted tax reduction. That's not in this year's budget. And finally, the legislature wanted to repay some loans we made from state idle funds. Half of that was done. The governor is saying, let's pay off the other half, about $138 million over 10 years. So all of these changes are part of what has helped her get to that 7.5% ending balance, if none of these are done, or if the legislature wants to cut taxes, as we're going to talk about, or spend money somewhere else, that ending balance becomes in jeopardy. One other bit of good news: so far this year, the state is running about $70 million ahead of the revenue estimate. So we're doing better. And if this continues over the next few months, that will also help. So I'm going to pause there. We're going to talk about a reaction of KASB and other groups in just a minute, but I would just welcome you if you have any questions. I'll get back to that. Go ahead and put them in the chat. But I want to let Scott talk a little bit about a statement that we're releasing with some other groups.
Well, thank you, Mark. As Mark said, the governor's new budget proposal fully funds the School Finance Act passed by the legislature and approved by the Kansas Supreme Court as constitutional. KASB and a number of other education groups decided it was important to show support for this proposal. And so we have put out, as we speak, we have put out a statement that you all should be getting that shows our support for the governor's plan, and also importantly, shows support for the legislators who have in the past endorsed this plan. And the statement, I think, really focuses on something that we probably all should be focusing on and getting this message out to our legislators, is the good stuff that the Gannon settlement has resulted in as far as hiring more teachers, hiring more paras, enhancing special ed, enhancing at-risk. So we have about, at last count, I think 10 organizations that have signed on to this statement, including, of course, KASB, including KNEA, the State Board of Education, and parents groups and lots of other groups. So you should be getting that soon. And we just think it's important that at this time, we show our support to continue the Gannon funding, because it has been, and also because of this really terrible time we find ourselves in. We know the COVID issue is going to cause a decrease in some learning. And so this funding is critical to continue to try to meet the success of Kansas students.
One of the things that we learned this week is that the legislature is trying to really fast track a lot of action in case they have to shut down again early. They're going to move up the budget process. That means consideration of the governor's budget may happen quicker than normal. So when you get this statement, we encourage you to look at it, to share it, and if there's information in it that you can use, perhaps having your local board take a position, take a clear statement for, use these reasons if you wish or whatever, but that seems to be wide support for continuing this, and we tried to articulate some of the reasons why. So certainly if you have any questions about that, and again, very pleased that the breadth of other statewide organizations decided to sign on to this, I think is positive from a unified point. Individual districts may be doing something like that on their own. This really captured the state groups the KSB tries to work with pretty regularly. Yeah. So I don't see any questions, Austin, but if you do have any questions later or direct to me or any other way that we can help you with understanding the budget or what's in it, please let us know.
And the link to that article, the joint statement from several education associations, is available there in the chat, so you can grab it there. Also available on the KSB website and over our social media channels. So wonderful work there done by this team and many others across the state. Let's keep talking on, in the state of Kansas and move into the legislature a little bit. Leah and Scott, some COVID bills were introduced and discussed this week. What do we know first about the Senate bill and then the House bill on COVID?
Sorry, Leah, you muted.
Apologies for that. My Wi-Fi dropped while you all were discussing the budget, and it muted me, and I had not realized that. So thanks, Austin. Yesterday, the Senate passed Senate Bill 14, which extends the COVID state of emergency that was enacted last in the special session by House Bill 2016. It extends that state of emergency and the mechanisms to deal with it through the end of March of this year. If the legislature does not act on that in the next couple of weeks, that state of emergency and its response mechanisms will expire on January 26th. So there's a sense of urgency by the legislature to at least get this temporary fix in place so that lawmakers can undergo what they have been describing as a deep dive into more substantive and long-reaching changes in the state's, emergency response code in order to broaden it to deal with statewide emergencies like a pandemic, because right now it really is designed more for local things like a fire, flood, or tornado. So Scott, I know the House Judiciary Committee was talking about a similar measure yesterday.
Right. On the House side, the bill is House Bill 2048, similar to the Senate bill, extends the state of emergency through March 31st, limits the governor in her response as those temporary limitations occurred. But the House Judiciary Committee approved a Republican amendment that would allow that deeper dive that Leah talked about. It would give the legislature even more time through January of 2022. Republicans say this is necessary because there may be disruptions to the legislature because of the pandemic. I guess they're learning about disruptions, what schools have had to go through all year. Democrats say this isn't a good idea because it just kind of lets the legislature off the hook and basically limits the governor for a longer period of time. So that bill was kicked out of the House Judiciary Committee, and I believe Judiciary has scheduled a hearing next week for the Senate bill. So both of these bills are kind of moving through the legislature, and we'll be following them certainly to see how they affect schools.
Leah, we also saw some movement and conversation on another Senate bill, this one talking about tax transparency. What do you have to tell us about that?
That's right. It's the Truth in Taxation or Tax Transparency Bill. It requires units of government to post a hearing notice and notify all of their constituents if they intend to adopt a budget which raises their revenue rates beyond a revenue neutral level. So, it's been, we know that property taxes are unpopular across the state, and that continues to be a refrain that we hear. And so, so the legislature worked on something like this last year, but they're making another run at it this year in the name of transparency. Now, you may know, most of you on here are school board members or superintendents, you know that you are already required to publish a notice and hold a hearing when you're adopting your budget. This would this bill, SB 13, does not make any changes to school district notification requirements. It just does include us in the notification that governments send to their constituents to say, here's how your overall tax burden is shaping up based on your various jurisdictions and their taxing ability. So we're included in that notice, but we are not included in the new requirements as far as posting notices and holding hearings. This bill also repeals the tax lid, which was pretty unpopular with our friends in county and city government. So it's kind of if you want to repeal the tax lid, that's fine, but you're also going to have to answer to the voters if you want to raise your taxes beyond a revenue neutral position. So that bill also ginned out of the gate right away as soon as the legislature convened, and it was passed pretty rapidly on the floor yesterday, and now goes to the House for further consideration.
Legislature also began and will continue to discuss several finance issues related to K-12 education, including LPA audits. Mark, Scott, Leo, what do we need to know about those conversations?
Well, we might want to start a little bit by just talking about both those audits and kind of the climate that we see going on. I guess the way I would characterize at least some legislators' reaction to the school environment that we're in. So there were two new audits that came out this year, ordered by the legislature from Legislative Post Audit. One was looking at school district cash balances. Many of you know this has long been a controversial point. Some legislators and organizations arguing that balances are too high. LPA basically said, well, there's a lot of reasons why you need balances. There are no clear guidelines by either the legislature or the state board. There's guidelines from like national organizations, and we kind of find that some districts over them and some districts under them, and one of the things you need to consider is risk, and that varies. So basically, this audit was purely informational. But again, I suspect at least some legislators will continue to raise the question that some districts, in their view, have excess balances, and in fact, total dollars have gone up even as a percentage more than budgets. There are various reasons for that, but we expect some scrutiny. There was also an audit done this year on bilingual education, which essentially said it's being run as it is supposed to be run, but it did raise some questions saying once kids come out of these programs, they continue to lag behind others on test scores. Now, I would argue one reason for that might be, I would guess, that a higher percentage of students coming out of bilingual programs are also low income or have other factors affecting them. But while there were no recommendations, that could be talked about. We're also going to see this week a look at the an audit from last year on at risk. This was an audit where the LPA said they did not believe the State Board of Education was exercising adequate oversight on how districts were using dollars, and essentially said that school districts are not focusing enough of their at-risk funding specifically on at-risk kids and using it kind of for all kids under the theory, well, that also helps at-risk kids. This led to several bills that would look at this, but none passed before the legislature shut down. This is kind of critical because, as many of you know, about $50 million in high-density at-risk weighting is sunset. It was extended by last year's budget bill by proviso, but that will eventually expire. And last year's legislature was clearly looking at trying to tie that extension to some further restrictions in at-risk funding. So we can expect that's going to be back. I think what it's going to really revolve around is ongoing legislative questions about how schools spend money, particularly now under COVID. There are deep questions about why are we, real simple. Now this is, I'm indirectly quoting, this is not Mark Tallman speaking. Why is it costing you more with fewer kids, because their enrollments are down, fewer teachers, staff is down, not in school, so you're not operating, and yet you say you need more money? Why is that? And so all of this comes down, I think, from people who maybe don't know how schools operate or are skeptical or whatever. It just comes back to what you get tired of hearing me saying, we have to be explaining to our legislators what our costs have been, what it's like to operate in this environment, how we're continuing to provide services, even if not operating. All of that, I think, is going to tie into a push by some legislators to either use these audits or use school closures to try to put some new restrictions on or requirements on how schools operate, or look at requiring districts be open, or any number of things that may be out there. So again, would welcome if there are questions on this, go ahead and put them in the chat. But those topics started this week, just ended. They're going to continue in several education committees next week.
So Mark, tied to that, it's certainly a strange legislative session. We spoke to that a little bit last week, but as we tried as members of the association, education leaders, to discuss things with our legislators, what's the best way to do that this year? What are some tools available to folks to make sure their voices are being heard?
Well, I certainly want my colleagues to join in with this. It is a strange year. I haven't been to the Capitol yet. partly because of some family quarantining issues, partly just, they're kind of discouraging crowds. And next week, the Capitol is closed, except unless you kind of have legislative permission because of concerns over possible violence around the national inauguration. But I do think that means, just as we've tried to do with our students and families, we have to try harder through email, through other forms of communication, through social media, whatever you can do. That's what we're trying to do. I certainly think as local advocates, you need to continue to be in touch with your legislators. And I think these discussions, what reason we have these is so that you can say, we had a legislative update that says there's some questions about cash balances. Just want to share with you, Senator or Representative, here's why we do what we do. Here's our percentage. Here's where money is in funds. We know there's questions about how we're operating. We've been in session. Here's our costs. We haven't been able to bring our kids back as much as we want. Here's why, but here's the costs associated with that. Use the fact that the legislators are asking these questions, holding these hearings, getting these briefings as a way for you to share information about what your district is doing. Scott or Leah, anything you want to add to that?
I think the only thing I'd add is, this could be a little bit of an opportunity, and we've talked about this before, for some of our folks who are more remote, can't travel 2, 3, 5 hours to go to Topeka for a hearing. That now, you can testify remotely. You don't have to take time out of your work day. And so this could be a good opportunity for some diversity in testimony that we don't always see because of just some of the logistics around traveling to Topeka to testify in person.
I do see a question, and this was something we were going to mention later among new bills as we have time. Legislation has been introduced to remove Leavenworth School District, introduced in Senate Education, referred back. So that's a bill that was introduced last year to address the equalization formula for bond and interest state aid. What I don't know, because I have not read this bill yet, is whether it is prospective or not. In other words, whether it would change aid only going forward or would come back and change the aid formula for bonds that have already passed. But that bill has been introduced, and we would expect to see a hearing on that in the next few weeks.
Well, the week did not stop at the legislature. We also had a State Board of Education meeting this week. So, Scott, what updates did the State Board have for us, and what did we learn from their time together?
Yeah, Austin, they had their monthly meeting virtually by Zoom, and basically they swore in their members. There's 2 new members on the State Board of Ed. Melanie Haas, Democrat from Johnson County, and Betty Arnold, Democrat from Wichita. And they elected new officers. So the new chair of the State Board will be Jim Porter, and the vice chair will be Janet Waugh. Jim is a Republican from Fredonia, and Janet's a Democrat. And both are from the Kansas City, Kansas area. And Janet, I think it was noted during the meeting, she's been on the board since 1999, which I guess certainly made me feel old. So both veteran hands will be leading the State Board this year. They elected Dina Horst and Ben Jones as their liaisons to the legislature. So if the Capitol ever does open up again, they'll be roaming the halls and talking to legislators. And one thing, I'm going to get into a little thing on bullying, but one thing I want to get out there is in his commissioner's report, Commissioner Randy Watson, he noted that there's preliminary data out there that shows there has been learning loss among Kansas students since this pandemic has hit. And he is going to come back in February with some recommendations on how to address that. So I think that's going to be a very important conversation. The state board also, they approved a plan that is aimed at reducing bullying in public schools. And it's a guidance, and it provides, it recommends that school districts provide to the boards an annual report on what the district is doing in terms of bullying or anti-bullying efforts. And it also includes a extremely comprehensive bullying prevention plan and resources toolkit. So that might be something school districts would want to avail themselves of. So this issue, of course, has been around forever. The legislature has been nudging schools to do more on bullying. And so we will see if this anti-bullying effort satisfies the legislature and also another and is recognized by school districts as something they need to do.
Well, as we look ahead to the next week and the next several weeks, there's lots of issues coming our way. Mark, we'll start with you. What are some of the bills that we're seeing brought back from last session?
Well, this first week, the Senate Tax Committee already started hearing on Senate Bill 22, which coincident is the same number of the same bill last session, which is very unusual. The subject matter is various adjustments to the state income tax code, some sought by the business community, some sought for decoupling the state and federal tax code, which really goes back to the federal income tax reform of about 2 years ago that created, in effect, a kind of windfall, some would say, to the state. That's been a point of contention ever since then by some. Hearings on that continue Tuesday. Another bill that passed last year and was vetoed by the governor, they're looking at again. Another bill, and I'm just going to quickly hit on these, but please ask questions if you have them, is now Senate Bill 2066 in House Commerce. It is essentially an expedited licensure bill. Basically says, and again, similar legislation passed both the House and Senate last session, but did not make it all the way through the process. And it basically directs licensing bodies to kind of expedite when out-of-state people want to move to Kansas. It's designed to say, get you a license quicker. So this could include teachers and educational licenses. There will, of course, be a debate over, well, does this allow us to maintain standards? And last year, the State Board of Education was kind of neutral on this, although licensure is really their responsibility. So we're kind of waiting to see where they come down, because that's always been the balance. How do you maintain standards versus often hearing from our districts? You know, I got to come back to this. I think it's interesting. Leah pointed out we may be getting more money from the federal government to hire more teachers when many of our districts say we can't find teachers now anyway. So it is a real challenge, and this could be part of that. So those are two things that are coming up. One other thing, I'm sorry, two other things that don't even have bill numbers yet that we'll be watching. The Promise Act was another bill passed and vetoed. It would have created essentially a new state post-secondary scholarship program aimed at basically career tech ed degrees through associate's degrees. And so this is being reintroduced, doesn't have a bill number, but it is expected to have a hearing in the Senate this week, and a bill from last year that did not make it through, dealing with authority for schools to have like emergency medications for anaphylactic shock and those sorts of things. So a new bill is being introduced. It is expected to have a hearing in House Education on Thursday, but we don't yet, at least as I've most recently seen, have the full text. So all of these are things that were really looked at and in many cases passed last year, but either were vetoed or didn't make it through the whole process. Another bill from last year coming back, which we may want to introduce our next segment on, has to do with the tax credits involving private schools.
And so a couple of bills we're watching there. Mark, the first one's being briefed in House K-12 on Wednesday. Tell us what they're going to be looking at.
Well, we're going to have the Thursday. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. It's been a long meeting so far. We have a bill introduced, 2068, that is similar to last year in expanding our state scholarship tax credit. I think Leah's going to talk about that, but before they have a hearing, they're going to get a briefing. And one of the things, this is the K-12 Budget Committee, is a U.S. Supreme Court decision from the summer, the Espinoza decision, which was based on an issue in Montana, I believe. Is that right, Leah? Where Montana had language very similar to Kansas, limiting public funds, prohibiting public funds to go to support religiously affiliated schools or educational programs. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that, and I think that the essence of what they said was states are not required to support private education, but if they do support private education, they cannot discriminate because schools are religiously affiliated. And so this, I'm sure, is being presented. They're bringing in some national experts, an assistant attorney general from Kansas and others, basically to kind of head off arguments that are often made that expanding aid to private schools, in addition to other issues, would violate the state constitution, which says that public education funds may not support sectarian education institutions. So that's part of what we're going to get. I think that's then going to lead into ultimately a discussion of that bill. And I think Leah wants to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Mark. The bill is, as Mark mentioned, 2068. It's identical to, I believe it was 2056. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, similar bill that was discussed last year in this committee, passed out, went to the floor. The bill expands the current tuition tax credit scholarships for low-income students program. It expands it as far as student eligibility. Current law says students on free lunch can access this program. The bill would expand that also to students on reduced lunch status. The current requirements are that the students who are eligible for this program must attend the 100 lowest performing elementary schools as designated by the State Department of Education. We can have a whole big discussion about why those schools are low performing and what the state might have to do with that, but we can save that for another day. This bill would expand that to all students in all elementary schools in Kansas would be able to take advantage of the tax credit scholarships. Take advantage, of course, loosely, because we don't know if the schools would take them. But again, that's conversation for another day. And the bill would require accredited private schools who are accessing or using those scholarships to post their accountability plans. It's a one-page accountability report, and they would have to link to that on the private school website. So as you know, KASB has a legislative position and that we are preparing to affirm this weekend that opposes tuition tax credits, vouchers, and any other types of programs that divert funding from public schools to private schools if they're not subject to the same accountability requirements as public schools. So that's what we know about that bill right now. At least I have not, at least in the last few minutes, seen a hearing scheduled for that, but I think, we'll see that briefing this week, and then we can expect a hearing to follow probably the week after that, I would imagine. And we've kind of been expecting this to come ever since that Supreme Court decision was handed down over the summer? And then, of course, you have the added pressure in some areas to, let kids play. Schools haven't come back fully in person. We need to have options, and so we kind of expected that this would happen. And sure enough, on the first day of bill introductions in House K-12, this bill was introduced by Representative Brenda Landwehr from Wichita. So that's what we expect on that bill. At least that's what we know right now.
Just a comment, I guess. I'm not an attorney, and I don't have dealings with the school choice advocates. But I believe it's fair to say that one reason Kansas and other states adopted these tax credit sort of indirect aid plans was to get around the constitutional issue. And so I think the question is, if there is a belief that there is no prohibition against direct aid, that could be another way of structuring it. This, in other words, right now, this program depends on people making contributions for which they receive a 70% tax credit to organizations, which then turn around and make these. So the idea was it kind of creates a semi-arm's length distance.
Right.
The biggest reason to do that, or I shouldn't say the biggest, a reason to do that is if you felt you simply couldn't have the state government like writing checks directly or something like that, either to schools or parents. So in some ways, this discussion of the Supreme Court decision may not really be relevant to this bill, but the fact it's going on, I think, indicates that there are multiple ways that other states and other proposals have been made to send support to private schools. This bill, although, as Leah says, dramatically increases the number of students that could be eligible, it doesn't change the state cap on tax credit dollars. So there is, I think, a $10 million limit on how much every year could go out in the form of tax credits. But we're not near to that point. So in other words, the program as it exists now has not been attracting enough, really, I don't think, and there's a new report posted, there aren't enough kids taking scholarships to use up all the money that's been provided, and all the money that's been provided is well below the cap that the state set. So I believe in the latest figures, something like, 600 students are receiving these scholarships out of the 500,000 public school students. That's essentially how many have made the move, if you want to look at it that way.
We do have a question in the chat asking if we've ever looked at or if any evaluation has been done based on the tax credits as they're utilized statewide, particularly if there's a rural or difference between rural and urban areas, and the issue of portability. So any insight into that question?
So I don't know whether anyone could quickly find that a link to the new.
I can. I'm gonna do that.
There is a
Stay
report,
tuned.
an annual report just up, but it may surprise you how many counties, for example, have students participating. But it is really triggered by your elementary school must be in this lowest performing level, so that you only kids in that, and then they have to find a private school that they can attend that wants to participate in this program. Overwhelmingly, these are Catholic schools that are participating. That's where most of the money is going. There are several scholarship programs that work in this area, and I think I did some math that 85% of these go to Catholic schools in Kansas, which are accredited. So there is a level of accountability that is not there for all private schools. So certainly most of these are in urban areas because that's where most of the kids are, and frankly most of the schools are. But there are some, Ness County, for example. Hope I'm not offending anyone in Ness County, but I believe there are 2 students qualified took advantage of this. Ellenwood, Kansas, I think is an example. So there are several places where you have some of those examples. And as far as portability, don't know what you mean by that, Kathy Ko. So if you want to further explain what you mean by portability, as it is now, it is simply if you, as a child, qualify by being free lunch eligible and attending, or a preschool student who would be attending one of these schools, you are then eligible, but you have to work through a scholarship granting organization, which gives you money to attend a qualified school. So you have to be eligible, you have to be triggered by your current public school, and then you have to have a accredited private school accredited by the state or a state approved accrediting organization in order to participate. So the issue that I think I'm seeing here, money goes to the private school. If it doesn't work, transfer back to the public. Does the money follow? Well, the money would follow in the same way it leaves. And I guess this is an important point. Public schools lose money if a child leaves, and that affects their enrollment. If they return to the public school and are counted in the enrollment, then you get the money back. I don't recall what the program does. Like if you leave the school in the middle of the semester, I believe there may be a proration of your of the scholarship, but I'm not positive. It looks like Leah is going to tell us what this map shows.
So this is a map that is going to actually, I believe, will be presented next week of the districts with eligible students. And so you can see, it's a little hard to tell from the colors, but you do have a few out in the more western areas of the state, but you've got 440 students from the Kansas City area, 420 some in the Wichita area, 120 some in the Topeka area, and then it drops off pretty sharply after that. So definitely utilized more in the urban areas of the state.
Lita, could you go to the next page?
Sure.
Okay, freeze it right there. So this gives you the cumulative example of the growth in the program. So in the current 2021 school year, number of students awarded scholarships was 632. And since the program started, it has been about 2,000. Number of qualified private schools with students enrolled actually looks like dropped a little bit. So if you access this link, which we'll put in, you can then go through and see some of the information about this program and the eligible schools involved.
Great. As we approach our hour mark, I'll encourage anyone that has any more questions for our group to drop those in the chat, and we'll try to get to them. As we give them time to do that, we've got about 10 or so bills that we're keeping our eye on that'll be coming in the next couple of weeks or so. So what can you tell us about those bills we're watching? And I'll just note Leah dropped that report into the chat if anyone wants to access that.
And again, I will encourage you to put in questions. We've got one from Lou, so I'm going to be real quick. Just note that we mentioned the Fort Leavenworth adjustment. The authority for districts to pay dual enrollment tuition was introduced. There's a bill you may or may not be interested that would prohibit the use of cell phones while driving for persons under 18. There's a House bill that would require the state board to develop state standards around sex abuse training. There's a bill dealing with teacher liability insurance, excess insurance. Bill from last year that would require students to pass a civics exam to graduate. And just this week, a new bill introduced which would authorize, in some cases, concealed carry permits for persons 18 rather than 21 and some reciprocity. The bill doesn't change where these individuals would be allowed to have them, but it would allow concealed carry permits in some cases for younger Kansas citizens, and then a bill dealing with raising the tobacco purchase age, which kind of comes out of last year's discussion around vaping and tobacco 21 and some of those issues. So we're going to keep getting more. Basically over the next 2 or 3 weeks is the time where everyone rushes to get their bills introduced. And then there are deadlines on bill introductions. We start moving into hearings and other deadlines. That's what we have now. And KASB will every day or every other day give you an update and a report on the bills that have been introduced. So it looks like Lou's question, Lee, I hope you're reading it, may have to do with CARES funding. So have you read that and have a response?
Oh, well, Lou just says, that finding personnel is going to be difficult, even if you have, as we just discussed, additional money to hire people. And he said, you've got a lot of baby boomers who are becoming retirement eligible, and they may just decide, hey, this might be a good time to retire. So challenges will continue regardless of the funding levels.
So I don't know whether Dr. Heim is still on. He may not want me to do this, but I'm just going to give you something to think about, because one of the things we hear from many districts, can't find enough people, we've got a shortage. So here's an interesting fact. Kansas has one of the lowest pupil teacher ratios and pupil staff ratios in the country. arguably, inarguably, we hire more people than most states for our population. Now, maybe that's really good. Maybe that helps have better results. Maybe that's what people want. But from a school leadership viewpoint, one of the questions is, if you're having trouble filling a position, at what point do you think about, well, do we need that position, or do we need to be structured the way we are? These are really difficult questions because we're all comfortable with what we do. But I think it's worth noting, one of the challenges Kansas faces is we have more staff per population than most. We are below average in our salary, in our funding per pupil. And I wasn't great at math, but what that tells me is that means there's fewer dollars for everyone we hire when you spread it around. So I think one thing I guess I would just invite as school leaders some reflection on is, as we look at some of these challenges, are we also looking at how are we organized? Are we optimally organized for the resources we have, knowing that we're going to have challenges to staff the way we've staffed in the past? Just something to think about. No charge.
We're always grateful for your free advice there, Mark. Not seeing any more questions in the chat, we'll begin to wrap up here. A reminder that this year in particular, the legislative session is moving very quickly. Things are adapting quickly. And so just a reminder of the resources that are available to you. The KASB website is a wonderful resource where you can find the calendar, up-to-date information on what's happening in the legislature, both the House and Senate, and updates on federal news. So visit the advocacy page, keep an eye on our newsroom, and make sure you're following both KASB and our advocacy team on social media. That's where they put a lot of information as it comes in. So they'll continue their hard work in the weeks to come, but things are changing quickly, and we'll try our best to keep you up to date. Mark, Leah, and Scott are doing daily updates when the legislature is in session. So they are putting out 5-minute-ish videos at the close of the day, generally Monday through Friday, to try to keep you up to date on what's happening at the legislature. So be sure to watch for those on social media as they come out. And as always, our team at KASB is here to help you and to be a resource to you as you continue to be a voice for public education in Kansas. So we appreciate you all joining us for this time this afternoon. Scott, Leah, Mark, thank you for your time and your hard work. We'll be here again next Friday at noon, so be sure to register for that. And